All right, welcome everybody. Absolutely delighted to have you here, and we have a very special guest who's going to do a little bit of an introduction. He needs no introduction in this town anyhow. His name's John Bertrand. He was a partner of mine at Quokka Sports, winner of the America's Cup, sports legend, hell of a good guy. John.
Well, hello Meredith. My role here is just to introduce Alan. It's 5 minutes and then I'm going to sit down, but I think fantastic to... someone said, actually a guy called Greg Sutherland, who's the new chair of the Alana Madeline Foundation. He's head of innovation for Australia Post, and before that National Australia Bank. He launched Ubank, and before that Boston Consulting partner. And we were going through some of the incubators here in Melbourne in my role as president of Swimming Australia. That's the whole Olympic program. And he said, look, you know, in the last couple of years, half the kids go to the pub and the other half are doing startups. And I think what a wonderful line that is. Alan, I told that to Alan, that's going straight back to Silicon Valley, I know that. But anyway, so Alan Rabadan, we used to sail against each other way back in the early 90s. And one time, very briefly, I was telling Alan about I decided to get back into this world of America's Cup and launch a challenge. 1995 America's Cup Challenge, and he said, how much do you need? And I said, I think 25 to 30 mil. And this is during a recession here in this country. In fact, globally, that's the recession we had to have in that early days. So money was tight. It was for a sporting contest, 25 million bucks, huge, way out of the park. And we came in after the race and having a beer at the Royal Brighton Yacht Club, and on the back of a beer coaster, he started to map out potentially how we could raise $25 million in this recession for a yacht race. And I said, Alan, I just love this. You've got to get involved with this damn thing. And he had a company here in Melbourne, and one thing led to another, and he headed up our whole technology thing. We went out to market and tendered, would you believe the audacity of it, tendered in terms of sponsorship, and Sun Microsystems won the tender for the technology, and that was effectively a $10 million investment. And one thing led to another. That was the boat 1995 won Australia America's Cup. The boat broke up and sank in about 40 seconds. We went on to beat all the other challenging nations except New Zealand. New Zealand went on to win the America's Cup against US defender, skippered by a man called Dennis Conner. But on the internet, that was the biggest thing on the internet, the sinking of that boat, other than the moon landing. Alan told me, and Alan doesn't exaggerate. And and then he went across and did a short course, effectively an MBA course at Stanford. And he said, John, now I've been trying to get shares in this company called Netscape, and I can't. This is 1995, the latter part of 95, and he said, we've got to get into this thing called the internet. And I said, how do you spell that? And at any rate, we started, effectively co-founded a company called Quokka Sports, which we then went to Silicon Valley with, and it became a major player globally in terms of broadcasting, as we said, total sports immersion from the inside looking out. And that was a company which we thought was probably 18 months ahead of our time, but in hindsight, we're at least 10 years ahead of our time. We're trying to push entertainment down copper wire instead of broadband. That was probably the differential. But it was one hell of a ride. Alan in Silicon Valley, we started the company here in Melbourne, had the choice, couldn't do it in Melbourne way back. We were talking about the late 90s, 1996, long time ago, and we said either London, New York, or San Francisco. Anyway, decided to set up in San Francisco, and Alan was home. That was it. Never to return. His accent's changed. Other than the DNA of the Ramadan family, you would never know that he's Aussie, but he is. Dual passport, love it. And one thing's led to another. Alan's just been great. He's done his own thing with Adobe systems and a whole bunch of stuff, and now this organisation, Play Bigger, breakout thinking in many ways. You talk about energy, it's just great. I'm taking some of our key execs of the Swimming Australia program across to Silicon Valley in the Bay Area in May, and we're in the business of over the horizon. What's a super high performance organisation look like by Tokyo 2020? So we're dealing closely with Red Bull Formula One team, the operations. We'll be visiting their laboratory in Los Angeles, brain research, micro decision making by the drivers, and how our swimmers can utilise some of that knowledge. Whole bunch of stuff going on. And would you believe Alan will be right in the middle of this on how the Australian swim team can actually get the job done in Tokyo 2020. So all these relationships are fantastic. And it's just wonderful to just spend a little time with Alan yesterday and tonight in terms of what he's doing here. But typical of this man and the people that he attracts, absolutely world class. There's no confusion. And so it's my great pleasure to hand it across to Alan and enjoy the evening.
Thanks a lot, John. Well, that's a pretty hard act to follow. Thank you, John, for a wonderful introduction, and again, welcome everybody. It's absolutely a pleasure to be back here in Australia, and we're launching our book called Play Bigger. And for those of you who don't know, I have 3 other partners who wrote this book with me, and Dave Peterson, Christopher Lockhead, the good-looking guy with the bald head, and Kevin Maney, who is actually a writer, and he did a lot of the work here. But the book is something that we learned over the course of the last 20 years of our own consulting business, as well as being executives in high technology. And hopefully you'll find it to be not only sort of inspirational, but very practical as well in terms of how you go about doing what we call category design. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about what we believe. And we believe, like many of the young entrepreneurs and you will meet some of them from the panel today, that creation wins. And that every product or service that we really love exists because an entrepreneur, a legendary one, had a unique insight about an unsolved problem. They just knew that there was something wrong with the world and they couldn't sleep until they solved that problem. It owned them, fundamentally took over their body, their mind, and they were really focused on solving this particular problem. And they did it by creating a great product, a really great company, and a category. And I want to tell you a story. This is not a technology story, but I'm going to tell you a story about one of those so-called legendary entrepreneurs. Anyone know who this is? Yes, good answer. Peter Long, as usual. This is Clarence Birdseye, 1920s. He was working in northern Canada, and he was up there with the natives from that part of the world, and he watched them pulling fish out of the lake, dropping them on the ice. The fish kind of froze pretty damn quick, and they would take that fish back to the places that they were living, igloos and so on, and they would be able to consume that fish for months and months later. And this is at a time when there was no airlines, probably no motor cars, or only a few, and really the only way of transportation was by rail. And so he came up with this idea that if you could do that for fish, well, why couldn't you do that for vegetables? And of course, he went on to really create what we know of flash freezing. He was obsessed with this problem. How do we get fresh food to people in a world where they don't live next to farms? That was his obsession. He created this thing called frozen foods. And then, if you think about it, what else did he have to do? He had to get a great product, but then he had to get the product to market. And the way he did that was he convinced the railway cars to go put frozen food or refrigerators in the railway cars. And then, if that wasn't enough, he had to go convince the supermarkets to actually put freezers in the supermarket. And we walk down what we call the frozen foods aisle today, and not only is there vegetables, but there's pretty much any other kind of food that you want. And we don't even know that a guy, Clarence Birdseye in this particular case, created a category, in this case frozen foods. We don't know that. But that individual absolutely did that. And it turns out that that particular industry is a $1 trillion industry. So legendary founder created a $1 trillion industry through that insight, and now not only is he doing frozen foods, of course there are millions and millions of others. And what Clarence worked out, which is what we talk about in the book, is he had to do 3 things fundamentally. He had to create a legendary product, i.e. in this particular case flash freezing, and how you package it, including cellophane, which wasn't a thing back then. He had to create a great company, how do you sell and distribute that? And then he had to create a great category. And in Clarence's case, he was out evangelizing fresh food. He was evangelizing that the enemy was canned food, tasted like yuck, and pretty much the entire United States at that time in the 20s took that belief, started consuming frozen foods, and of course we walk up and down the supermarkets today just assuming that was always there. That's one entrepreneur, one legendary entrepreneur who went on to build a great category. And there's actually a science behind categories. It's been a not that well studied subject in the past. We invested quite a lot of money for a small company that we are in category science, and I just want to take you through a few things. We did both what we call quantitative research, which is we looked at all the numbers and databases and things like that around the world about startup companies. We also did qualitative. We did over 100 interviews, and many of them in the book. There's about 135 interviews actually in the book, and which was really trying to understand what they did. This is kind of what happened, and this is what the great leaders actually did. And we have 3 insights for you today. They're all in the book. The first one is that, for the most part, technology world is a winner-take-all game. It really is. You think about a social network. Who's the winner of the social network category? Okay. Who's number 2?
Who cares?
Right. Who cares? There isn't one, right? It's a winner-take-all marketplace. And in fact, I can tell you, having done the research, that the category king, as we call them, the company that owns, defines, and dominates the market, actually takes 76% of the market cap of the entire category. Right? So social networking is about a $500 billion category. Facebook is worth $400 billion today, right? So this is about taking all the marbles. You're playing for all the marbles. Don't be confused about playing for number 2 or number 3 or number 4. They get less than 10 or 15% of the market cap. And the smart venture capitalists, the smart investors, the smart employees all know that. And that's why those VCs are successful, because they invest in what we call category kings. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that the categories themselves have a natural life cycle. When you first hear about a category, the value of it is 0, right? But over time, it develops and accelerates in the middle, and ultimately during what we call the dominate phase, it starts to plateau off. And there's a famous VC in America who says he's looking for $0 billion markets. That's what he wants to invest in. He wants to invest in these particular markets in the early stages so that when they become big, that's when he's in. At the same time, when they first come out, you see that there's a plethora of other companies going out there and competing for that same marketplace. So there's a number of vendors. In the middle, you've got growth, and you've got what we call expanding margins, because the number of companies goes down, pricing power goes up to the company. That's where all the value actually gets created, in what we call the develop phase. So you want to be the company that does the definition and then rules during this develop phase, and generally that's somewhere in the 5 to 10 year range of a particular category. And then the third thing is that categories themselves aren't static. For those of you who know technology, this is the CRM category, the evolution of the customer relationship management category. In the early days, in fact, before the 1980s, how did we actually store phone numbers? Anyone remember? What is it, Bob? What were they called? Rolodexes, that's right. It was a piece of paper that you wrote, believe it or not, kids, believe it or not, we used to write the number down on a piece of paper, and it was in a Rolodex, and if I wanted to call Bob, I'd look up Bob, I'd find his number, and I'd dial. I'd have a phone bolted to the wall, I'd pull it off, and I'd ring it. That's how it went.
But I also had my little black book.
Yeah, you might have had a black book too, that works. Then what happened, the PC revolution came out, and 2 companies, Act and Goldmine, said, hey, Bob, stop storing them on the Rolodex, put them in the computer. Then if I want to look up Bob, I'd type in Bob, Bob's number would come up, I'd dial it. And then people say, well, gee, if you're calling Bob and you know his number, why don't you put any notes about the conversation with Bob into the system? That became Salesforce automation. And then what happened is this guy called, did anyone know who created the client-server CRM marketplace? Darryl, you must know. Tom Siebel, good answer, whoever said that. He said, no, it's not just about the front end of the business, it's all of the business, field, service, customer support, and everything else. And he rolled it into a thing called customer relationship management. So that category then evolved again, and then of course, cloud CRM is owned by probably the greatest category design all time, Mark Benioff. And so categories themselves kind of evolve over time. So that's the third thing you kind of need to understand. Okay, and then there's 4 really cool things that we found out about Australia. We said, okay, if we're going to go to Australia, we need to to talk the Australian language, and having been here and being part of the sort of the history of technology. And by the way, in this room, I want you to know, there are some of the original founders and original angels of all time. Bob, put your hand up, say hi. Randall Straw over here was the Victorian government, helped actually create the technology world. Randall, put your hand up. And there's a number of other people here. So if you don't already know, there's some legends in this. And here's what happened. For the most part, what happened was regional category kings kind of emerged. And this is the industry that these folks helped create. It started off as a $0 billion marketplace back in 1994, and it is today about a $20 billion market. And these companies, everything from CompuShare to MyOb to REA, carsales.com, what they did was they said, hey, there's this really cool thing happening around the world where you put sales online, you sell them, let's do that for Australia. Very successful business model. Very, very successful business model. And many of those companies, and here they are here, NextGen, Menulog, What If, iProperty, all these companies did that and then got acquired by other companies that were global category kings to fill in the Australian marketplace. So these legendary entrepreneurs figured out that they could adapt a global category for the Australian marketplace, created immense value, as you can see, and our hats are off to everyone in the room that was sort of part of that. We really salute you guys. But then something happened, and I was a part of this, and so was John, and a few other people in the room actually, who were from Quokka. Put your hands up, those people who actually were at Quokka Sports. Here we go, Rob Begg, you'll see him over here. Well, there was a little blip on the radar back here in the 97, 98, 99 period. Looksmart, Evan with Looksmart and Quokka Sports, and there's a couple of others. And it was really the first attempt by an Australian company to be truly global. Went to Silicon Valley, raised money, went public, did all that stuff. But the really exciting thing is actually the recent times, the first truly global category king called Atlassian actually came out of Australia. Really exciting for all of the entrepreneurs here, because it showed, in this particular case, $6 billion market cap got created by a group of people from Australia. And what's most exciting, and that's what we're going to start talking about here in a little bit, and having met a number of you, is it feels like a real renaissance in this city and in Sydney from the folks I've talked with. It feels like there's a breed or a generation of entrepreneurs who are really embracing kind of the global first mentality and creating companies that really do address a global marketplace. And there's a bunch of them. And in fact, we've got some of these folks on the panel. In fact, Didier from Culture Amp, one of the hottest companies in Australia, is going to be with us to talk about his company in just a moment. There's a bunch of other ones. And these are companies that are creating the category as opposed to adapting it, which is a super exciting time for these organizations. And the final thing is, and you've got some folks who are going to be on the panel in just a moment, some of the best VCs and incubators from this part of the world are going to join us for a conversation. And all of that energy is now being fueled by experienced venture funding as opposed to private equity or any of the other forms of investments that really don't work for this kind of a marketplace. And this is venture capital investments by Australian-based VCs in Australian companies. And if you look at this, this is real growth. We're really seeing Australian VCs making investments in this part of the world. So the thing that, in addition to building an incredibly good product and building a great company, these companies now have to take responsibility for creating a category. They have to create the equivalent of CRM or a social network or an advertising platform. And that's the challenge now that Didier and all of the folks from his generation really do have. They've got to do that from Australia on behalf of the world, as opposed to taking something that's been adapted. By doing that, to do that, they really need to practice this thing, which we call category design, which is a topic of the book that we wrote called Play Bigger. And I'd like you to start getting questions ready. We want to get to questions pretty quick. And in fact, we have, and I haven't even heard this yet, but there is a new English version of the narration of Play Bigger. We have a US version, but the English version has arrived today. And for the first 10 people who ask questions, you're going to get a free one of these. Okay, so get your questions ready. And I'd like you to join me in welcoming an incredible panel of folks. And here they are. So if I could be joined by Rick, Didier, Samantha, and Professor John McCormick, would you join me on the stage? Give them a warm welcome, folks. So Rick is leading venture capitalist. John is leading academic. Didier is a legendary CEO, and Samantha is running arguably the best incubator here in Australia. So you've got a pretty esteemed panel of folks here who are going to talk about this, and I'm going to throw it to Rick to start us off and say, Rick, does this resonate? Is this really a renaissance that's happening?
Absolutely. So, I'm biased because this is what we spend our lives. This is what, I've kind of bet my career on, is that there are going to be some huge category kings, to use a word from tonight, built out of Australia over the next 5 years. And I think we have a really good chance of seeing some multiple billion-dollar outcomes coming out of our startup ecosystem over the next 5 years. And so Blackbird Ventures is the firm that I founded, and our mission is to back with capital and help the most ambitious founders in Australia who want to do things on a global scale, not just a local scale.
Cool. Didier is one of those companies. Didier is the CEO of a pretty hot company. Didier, does this resonate? Is this true? Is this really what's happening?
Yeah, I think it taps into the fact that we can do this now from Australia. There's a desire to do it. There's an opportunity to do it. And I think tapping into what Rick said, and Blackbird's an investor in Culture Amp, at one point early in our journey, somebody wanted to acquire us who in many ways was a category king of the space. And when we went through the whole process, I remember saying to them, I don't want a reasonable outcome here. I didn't start a company to get a reasonable outcome. Unless you're going to give me an unreasonable outcome, I'm going to keep doing it myself, which is why I'm still here. And I think it is that thing that, it's for people that are too masochistic to know that they don't have an opportunity not to do this. You have to get out there and build it and try and make it happen.
Samantha, I know you get involved in a lot of early stage ventures. Do you want to tell the audience a little bit about sort of the number of companies you look at and what you're looking for?
I mean, to date we sort of really run one batch a year, and we accept sort of 6 to 8 companies. It's a very bespoke experience. We surround them with around 70 odd mentors and alumni who help them over a 12-week period to kind of build a significant and enduring business, and we find them really at the beginning of their lives. But I guess to your point around this category king stuff, at a very basic level, those regional category kings as well as the global ones, such as Atlassian, they are the mentor network. They're the capital that actually goes into the companies. And I think also they are these lighthouse companies that actually inspire a whole generation of companies to go global from the beginning, aspire to own a part of the world. And I think that's really, really significant as well.
Yeah, you need sort of role models, right? I mean,
absolutely.
People who have actually made $1 billion to actually point the entrepreneurs to and say, this could be you. This gives you the fuel to fight, to head after it, right?
Totally. And I think, the program's been running for 6 years. It's about to launch in Melbourne in July, actually. So we'll be doubling up our intake. But the really significant difference over the last couple of years is previously all the successful, as in raised a round of funding, companies had to relocate to San Francisco to grow their companies. That trend has totally been reversed. Right. They are predominantly staying here in Australia, building their product and engineering teams here, potentially opening a satellite office in San Francisco for marketing and sales purposes. But they are invigorating the ecosystem here.
Yeah, that's cool. Well, John, from Monash University, this is something you're immersed in, even the earlier stage than that. These are kids that are going through undergraduates, and how does this resonate, and how does it meet with what you're doing?
Yeah, so I think universities have undergone a really fundamental change, and this is really the new normal for us now. We get a lot of students coming in who want to be entrepreneurs from the beginning. It's not something that comes to them later, and we've got a lot of successful alumni running leading companies in the tech area, not just in Australia but overseas as well. I think this is really the right time for Australia to be embracing this. There's a lot of big global political changes that make perhaps the US and Europe a little bit more difficult.
Really? What would they be?
4 letters come to mind. So I think we're at this position now where everyone wants to be involved in this, and I think when I started at university, the idea of being able to originate something new to make a change in the world was something that I just thought was something for older people to do. But now we're getting kids coming in from high school with fantastic ideas. who are already entrepreneurs, and they're going to be the next leaders. So it's very exciting.
And actually, we were having lunch earlier, and Rick was telling a little bit about this robotic competition that he just sponsored. You think the undergrads are early. Rick, tell the audience a little bit about
there's this
what's
competition
going on.
called First Robotics. It's my favourite thing in the world. I spent last week judging it up in Sydney, judging the Australian Nationals, and it's actually a US program that's come here, and it's all about building a robot and then making robots similar to sport for teenage kids. And the idea is to drive them into engineering and mathematics and science subjects. But it's so much more than just building a robot. These teams of teenagers have to form their team, they have to go and organise their team, choose their leaders, go and raise capital from sponsors, and then they have to build these robots and play in contests. And it is the most incredible thing to see, A, how these kids organise themselves, and B, the robots that they build. This is going to be wonderful.
How old are the
for our
kids?
Community. They're 14 to 18. There's also a first Lego League, which is 9 to 14. It is the most wonderful program if you ever see it. There's only 3 teams in Melbourne, and we're trying to get a whole load more. So if anyone wants to
Get your
help
kids
me
into
do
it.
that, come and see me.
Yeah.
It's a really, really great. It's driving hundreds of kids into entrepreneurship every year.
Okay, so questions. Come on, there must be questions already coming from here we go, Matthew. Microphone over here, please.
Matthew Pryor from Observant. How important is ecosystem in category creation? So what I mean, my background is ag tech. When Bob first helped us get a start over a decade ago, there was no such thing. Today there seems to be a lot of hand wringing, especially at government levels, about do you need a special expertise? So, Sprout X and things like that, they're happening in Melbourne. We've got an ag tech specific accelerator and we're going to create ag tech companies. How important is that versus just the vision and the perseverance and everything else at an individual level that's required?
Yeah, well, let me answer it first and then throw it to the panel in a sec. So first of all, sort of one of the things we talk about in the category design discipline is the notion that you, as the category king, are responsible for building an ecosystem. It's not like something else gets done. It's your job to be the thought leader and to build an ecosystem. I'll give you one example. Anyone been to San Francisco during Dreamforce? Anyone been? Is that just the worst experience?
Yes.
There are millions of people there. In fact, there's not enough hotel rooms. Mark Benioff had to hire a ship so that folks could actually have beds to sleep. That's an ecosystem, right? That's all of the folks that really are building their solutions on top of, in this particular case, the Salesforce platform, right? And that ecosystem takes on a life of its own. I saw it at Adobe when I was working there. We had thousands and thousands of developers building all kinds of extensions to those products. That is almost impossible to defeat. Like, no matter how crappy you think the Salesforce platform is, and it is, even though he's had incredible success as a category designer, the fact is the ecosystem is almost impenetrable. So, I mean, I'm not part of the Australian ecosystem, but I'd be fascinated to hear, Didier, what this means for you, both here in Australia as well as in America.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing is excellence begets excellence. So it's actually much more important to be surrounded by amazing people and amazing companies than it is that they're doing what you do. And I think that works across the level. Like, I want to hire great people, and those people could be engineers in a cybersecurity company. It's much better for me to have a world-class cybersecurity company as a neighbour rather than another HR tech or data analytics or whatever the thing is. So I actually do think we're sometimes caught in that trap where people are still thinking about physical proximity as the core, that we have to get all these people together and in the same building and wonderful things will happen. Just get a lot of really good people together, and so you can share war stories, because it's really, really hard. But when you see somebody else succeed, that inspires you. You get good people and it feeds upon itself.
Anyone else from the panel?
Yeah, one of our mantras at Blackbird is founders helping founders. And in Silicon Valley, that's such an important part of the thing that is Silicon Valley. It's really successful people then giving both capital and expertise back to the next generation. And I don't think that was really happening in Australia 5 or 6 years ago. I think a lot of people who did really well in tech either stayed over in the US or kind of went and bought real estate and disappeared off to farms and things. But I think that's really starting to change. And I think the generation, if we look at the Atlassian guys and the Campaign Monitor guys and the Aconex guys, and they're all now starting to want to invest and give back. And at Blackbird, we have a big, one of our mantras is founders helping founders. And we have 104 tech founders who are our investors, who then help. And I think that's starting to happen in Australia, and that's really exciting. And the very best sort of founder advice is someone who's just one step above you on the ladder. If you're trying to raise a seed round, it's someone who raised a seed round, last week. And I think that's happening too. Founders are forming their little ecosystems. I think it's less about the government kind of creating these hubs and accelerators and thises and that's, and more about the organic, awesome kind of cyclical thing that's starting to happen, organically. And that's what excites me, rather than kind of, trying to artificially create it. It's hard to do, it's chicken and egg stuff.
Another question from the back here. Yes, sir.
This is more directed at the venture capitalists. One of the things as an entrepreneur myself that I have ran into is the fact that majority of venture capitalists or early round investors often do have this pessimistic approach in terms of actually investing in a new startup. How would you, as a venture capitalist, be able to advise the entrepreneurship community? How can you navigate those challenges or those obstacles without us having to look further beyond to Silicon Valley as a way of entering into the market?
Well, before Rick answers that
that's
question,
a tough
let me.
one. I'm gonna let Sam start
yeah,
on
or
that
Sam.
one.
I just want to say one thing. I think that if there's an investor who's pessimistic about early stage investing, they're in the wrong business.
Absolutely.
Okay, like literally in the wrong business. And that's when John and I were fundraising for Quacker Sports in 1995. We met a bunch of folks in Australia, and it wasn't that they were dumb or anything like that. It was that they were private equity folks. They're looking for different things. They asked us for a 5-year business plan. We didn't have a 1-year business plan. So now, the good thing is you've got Samantha on here who looks at these kind of things
Yeah.
every day, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. And so, we're an early stage, often we're the first money in, we're the first 75K check. And an interesting thing that's happened this year is that 5 out of the 6 companies we accepted had all raised rounds of capital before coming into StartMate or at the same time as coming into StartMate. And they were ranging between 300K and 500K rounds. So there are people out there willing to, fund those early stage companies. The difficulty is still finding those people. And I think the best, advice I can Accelerate is a good place to consolidate all that knowledge, right? There are 51 companies who've all interfaced with, call it 50 to 100 VCs and investors each in order to try and raise a round. And so they're really good places to kind of hack that knowledge quickly. But apart from that, look at the companies in your ecosystem from, Culture Amp up and down, and just go and ask them, who invested in your company? Who did you enjoy working with? Who did you not enjoy working with? And to your point, absolutely. It's risk capital. That's what venture capital is. There's, no use being pessimistic. You're in the wrong game. If that's your approach. And if you talk to companies that are doing well and have raised money, I'm sure they can point you in the right direction.
Anyone else want to?
I'd also just add, it's not just being pessimistic, it's also they have a worldview. It might be different to your worldview. Keep going till you find someone that has your worldview. One of my favourite things is it doesn't matter how many people don't believe in your idea. All that matters is how many people do. And I was actually pretty lucky in my process, and I spoke to other people along the way, and they would tell me, they got invested on the 150th pitch. You get pretty good after doing 150 pitches.
Yeah.
Or you give up, and if you give up, you sort of answer your own question. I remember John and I did about 25 pitches before we had one investor come in. This is 2 Australian guys over there and a few others. And as soon as that investor came in, everybody else wanted back in on the deal. It's funny. You're exactly right. When the first money lands, oh yeah, well that was such a great idea. We were considering it and all that kind of stuff. So find that one that does believe in your vision and get on with it. Daryl, do we have another one?
Yeah, right here.
Yes, sir.
Extending the discussion to valuation, how are things moving in terms of how companies are interacting with multiple stakeholders to reach that valuation?
So valuation in the early stages is always a horse trade. It's just kind of, there's rules of thumb, and then it's just how much demand you can get for your funding round. In Silicon Valley, there are these term sheet wars, which you get 4 or 5, you get a hot, usually founding group in a hot area, and you get 4 or 5 VCs all trying to, outdo themselves, and you get these wonderful sort of cascading up prices. That's not happening so much in Australia, apart from very top, maybe 1 or 2 a year. But I would say now, I think 5 or 6 years ago, Australia used to be like 30%, valuation used to be about 30% less than Silicon Valley. It was a bit of an arbitrage play. for a VC and being able to invest here, take it over to Silicon Valley in the next round, get a nice pop. I don't think that's happening anymore. I think for the good companies, the top 5% of companies that are out there, it's a global valuation market. Everyone's reading the blogs, right? Silicon Valley 5 or 10 years ago was this closed shop. You didn't know about it unless you went over there and networked into it. Now everyone's blogging, everyone's tweeting, everyone's building their brand, and so valuation is part of that. Everyone's a lot more visible. So I think there's good valuations in the market here in Australia now. You don't need to go to Silicon Valley to get them, if you're a really good team.
That's a great answer. Mike.
Hi, Peter here, Rebel Rouser. Question more, if I look around the room, I see a few people with grey hair and, lack of hair and whatever. Not you, Bob. So my question is, what does the panel think about the more mature entrepreneur? I mean, we talk about, teenage kids getting into robotics and whatever, and, start mates typically, sub 25 type entrepreneurs. What's the panel's view on the more mature entrepreneur?
Sam, do you want to start with that? And maybe John, I'd like to hear from you too.
Yeah, I think it's a cliche that accelerators and incubators attract these, young hoodie-wearing kids. I mean, in just this batch, we have quite a lot of people with grey hair, with children in their early 40s. This is not their first rodeo necessarily. One of them is a fabulous semiconductor company. I mean, designing a new type of Wi-Fi chip, you can't really do that straight out of college most of the time, right? You actually have to have some life experience and extra subject matter expertise. So, I mean, that's absolutely not true at all, that it's a place only for young people who can, live on ramen for 3 months or whatever. It's, yeah.
What are you seeing from your side, John?
So I think it's very interesting because we get a lot of young students coming in and we run sort of incubator programs and things for them. And what's always struck me is that a lot of them are so enthusiastic and so passionate and so bright, but they're also just incredibly naive as well. And I just don't think they have the experience that perhaps someone who's been in the industry for a bit longer can bring. So kind of partnering them up brings the best of both worlds. You get that youthful exuberance and enthusiasm, and the ability to work 48 hours straight and then come back the next day and still be excited. But you also bring someone who can just ask those really difficult questions. Say, have you thought about this? And that's something that I often see that's missing in a lot of the younger students that we get coming through.
I just add that one of the pattern matching for founders that we kind of really interested in at the moment are those founders that have built a business that's been a success, but kind of a moderate success. It's not enough for them to go and retire. They might have built an agency business or a consulting business that sort of is difficult to scale, and now they want to do the next thing, which is a real level up and step up. And that kind of founder is really interesting and tend to be obviously a little older.
And if I could just add one quick thing to that as well. I think actually the data shows that more successful companies are founded by people in their 30s than in their 20s. There's a few outliers that kind of colour that for everyone. We found a Cultramp in our mid-30s with kids, and it was hard, but it brought all of those other things along. But I think actually the bigger thing that's really interesting is that age diversity in tech is as big an issue as gender diversity. So when you look at the actual groups of people working, there's incredible bias towards people that are older, and whether or not they're able to use the latest stack or whatever it is. And it's something that I think we're just starting to see move. We're starting to see people get engaged a little bit more in that, but it's actually a big issue. It's a really big issue if, as we're now going into, it's not just about writing software, it's software that's applied to all these interesting problems that require other experience. Yeah, exactly. So it's a hot topic.
Yeah, and just one observation, again, from a guy who was born here but is really an outsider is, when I started talking with Rick, how many founders in your original fund? Is it 100 something, 104 original individual investors?
Investors, we have 97 in our first fund and then 104.
Okay, so think about that just for a second. So 97 people who have had successful careers in technology are investing in his fund. And as a result, if you get invested by him, you get access to those people. Who wouldn't want to speak to 97 people who have been successful like him? And that's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So, and that's, if you think about sort of Silicon Valley and the secret of Silicon Valley, and certainly the people I work with on a daily basis, these are folks who have been incredibly successful. And whether they're old, young, man, woman, whatever it might be, the reality is you want them on your side. So, okay, another question. Rohit.
So obviously there's been a lot of talk about how the ecosystem's developed over time and how we're seeing a lot more founders coming through and better founders coming through. From a VC accelerator and startup perspective, what one thing would you like to see more of in the ecosystem?
I think the thing that I talk to founders, Australian founders, the most about is how to scale up and how to think bigger, which plays well
Play
into,
bigger.
into play bigger, which, you know, I spend the most time talking to founders about what if we took the money constraints off the table, how could you do this? You know, you want to do this, how can we 100 times this? And how can you spend more money faster? Whereas I talk to my friends in venture capital in Silicon Valley, it's kind of the opposite. They're trying to tell the founders not to spend money all at once. So we still, there are still only a very small percentage of founders in Australia that really kind of thinking super big.
Alan, can I make a comment? Just
Bob,
about that?
please, absolutely.
Okay. I totally agree with you. Right? And what I like about your chart the last 6 years, which is fantastic, because I spent 20 years trying to get that 6 years to happen, right? When I was back, with Al and before Quokka and a few other things, and I had Bank Ventures and Menlo and all the rest, right?
Yeah.
We were doing what you're doing.
Yeah.
Bank Ventures, I had 300 founders.
Yeah.
300.
Yeah.
Okay? Including, most of the guys that went on, like Greg McAdoo and Sequoia and Intel, Johnny Field, the old bloke, bit of grey, right? And that's what I really love about what's happening now, right? I think you're dead right to answer your question, right? And I agree with all the panel on this, right? Alan's comment about what VCs and early stage of VCs are like in the Valley now, right, is kind of where, seriously, right, we were maybe 20 years ago. And on steroids, we just, whatever, bore the living shit out of you. The flip that's taken here is the most important part of the lot, right, seriously, right? If you can do, and if you can grab and you can start to think big with this last 6 years, right, don't waste your time in Silicon Valley. Most of the guys that were thinking like you were 20 years ago, like me, grey, balding, worried about their dividends and their grandchildren, whatever. Okay, but the issues is the time is now, and to me, this is really what this is all about, right? And I think these sorts of formulas is the thing you need to listen to very carefully. It's not about the money.
Yep, no, that's right.
Not about the money.
It isn't. And again, sort of, if you think, you asked the question of sort of what should people be looking for in founders, and one of the things that I would say is that we teach a course at Stanford University each year on category design, and it's to the Masters of Science and Engineering folks at Stanford, like the creme de la creme of the engineers. The first, and they're taught to be skeptical, especially of marketing bullshitters, right? So the first lecture that we go in to speak to them about, we tell them we first of all give them all the stats, and that's sort of like, okay, well that's really interesting. But most of them truly believe that if you make shit and sell shit, everything else is bullshit. Like literally, that's how they're wired. That's what engineers are like. And the truth is that in terms of Australia, I've seen a little bit of that here too, that it's a very product-oriented kind of perspective, right? The truth is the great legends of time, and there's 135 examples in the book, have actually done not only product and company, but also this third thing called category. They've defined the playing field. They've created the, if you like, the RFP for that particular category. And when you do that, you own it. There's no second in search, there's no second in social networking, there's no second in really on online retail right now, because they've defined the playing field so broadly that no other company, no matter what technology they have, can really come in. And that piece of sort of belief that it's not just about the product and it's not just about agile development, it's more about this strategic sort of intent, that's something that I think folks from this part of the world will grok and really get on with. Okay, another question coming from up here.
So just picking up on that category creation question, and it kind of loops back to the question earlier about valuation. If you're creating a category and you have to establish an ecosystem to really sort of turbocharge that, does IP become less relevant to things like speed to market in the future, for instance?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and we get asked the question about intellectual property quite a lot. And actually, the course that we teach at Stanford is in conjunction with a lady by the name of Anne Muraco. She's by far the most successful female VC in Silicon Valley. And she says there's 4 pillars of business. There's essentially the intellectual capacity of the founders and understanding of the problem. The second thing they know is the sort of how do you solve that problem. Third, how do you scale a company. And 4, how do you define a category. That's sort of her stack, for want of a better term. So yes, it is really important that the founders have a founding insight, whether it be a technical insight like VMware, which is like I can virtualize a server, or a market insight like it sucks to try and find a cab in San Francisco. For Christ, I just want to be able to dial one up, and hence Uber, right? They being, in the case of Anne and Mike Maples from Floodgate, they are looking for those insights in the founders that actually start the company. And if you don't have that kind of an insight, it's probably pretty hard to get funded. But I'd be interested in sort of anyone else on the panel's view on that.
I mean, on the IP front, the last time I filed for a patent was 20 years ago.
Yeah.
I did it once, and I'd never do it again. Now, there are businesses that are built on patents. It's just not the businesses I build anymore. And it was an interesting process to go through. Other people have the same experience.
Yeah. We don't put a lot of...
There was a case just 2 weeks ago.
Can we get a microphone here, Daryl, please? Thanks.
Case just 2 weeks ago where an Australian startup was saying, actually, we're opting out of actually doing the patent thing because actually our competitors can discover more from that patent in the first place anyway, so why would you give that away? Which I thought was a big challenge for anyone who's in patent law right now, and also the regulators of it.
Well, let me give you another example. In the book, we talk about Elon Musk, and you think about what he did. For those of you who don't know, Elon Musk is the inventor of the Tesla motor car, the electric car that's going bananas in the United States right now, and probably in this part of the world too, right? Yeah. So he was struck with this problem, which was the batteries are the sort of the governor on how fast the industry can grow. So what did he do? He actually open sourced all of his patents. He went the opposite way and said, screw it. Everybody can start building batteries because that's actually going to bring the pricing power down, or the price of the batteries down, increase innovation and everything else. And so the category kings actually do the opposite to actually creating patents. There are some companies, to Didier's point, that business is to be either a patent troll or sit on patents, and big companies presumably do that, but the innovators I don't think. Another question.
I might just add something to that. I mean, I guess at where I sit, really, really early, the first couple of $100,000 in, the question isn't, are lots of people going to copy it? Can they even build it? It's really, does anybody care? And spending like tens of thousands of dollars on a patent, which could be 50% of your fundraise at that point, just doesn't make any sense.
Right. Okay, we have another question from the front.
Yeah, hi, my name's Paul Waldron. You started off with the whole premise around creating a category and category giants. Do any of you find that theory a little bit disheartening if we're to believe that Facebook own the social media space and that Amazon own the online retail space? And sure, there can be new categories created every day like we've seen with Uber and the electric car and all that sort of thing, but there's going to be a limit to that as well. So at what point does an entrepreneur decide to challenge a category killer? Because like you had MYOB up there. Now I would suggest that MYOB's been well and truly challenged by Xero. So, when do you identify that a category killer is assailable?
Yeah, so category kings, it's essentially, once a category king's kind of created themselves and created that sort of category in the marketplace, it's really theirs to lose. Having said that, that doesn't mean they can stop. And if you remember that CRM chart that I showed you, where it started out with Act and Goldmine as sort of the original contact managers, they missed the whole point that the category expanded to actually include a whole bunch of other data about, hey, the conversation you and I just had. And so who came in, and Brock Systems actually came in and completely disrupted that category. So those Act and Goldmine companies went away because somebody redefined that category in a broader context, solving a bigger problem. And then if you think about it, what did the folks at Siebel Systems do? They took the Salesforce automation category, for want of a better term, and then created a much bigger wrapper for that, added all of these different things in. And so and then of course, Siebel was a client-server based architecture and solution. And what did Benioff came in and he said, well, there's a different thing, it's called the cloud, and you should be doing all this in the cloud. And so let me give you another example that's sort of more of a personal example for us, which is, if you think about it, back in the times when sort of word processing was owned by Wang, and then ultimately sort of what was the big word processor? I'm just blanking for a second. WordPerfect, thank you so much. WordPerfect was the category king of word processing, by far the best. Lotus 123 was the best spreadsheet, and Harvard Graphics was by far the best presentation software. Microsoft didn't come in and say, I'm going to create a better one of those. They said, that's a dumb question. The real question is office productivity and what you do in your front office. Oh, by the way, we'll wrap together Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and ultimately sort of mail and exchange and everything else. Put that into the office. And then they created a new term, which didn't even exist back then, which was called front office. That wasn't a thing. That was what they invented. So they redefined the category to be front office, which wasn't even a thing back then. The rest is history. All those companies are gone. Microsoft owns 80% of the marketplace for that. Now, that's not the end of the story though, right? Right. Who's coming in with documents and all, who's that? Google, absolutely. So they say, well, hell, you know, that's fine if you want to distribute software, but all the kids want to do it in the cloud. And guess what? They're getting disrupted too. So categories themselves don't just sort of like, ta-da, you know, you win and it's game over forever. It's not. The technology adoption sort of life cycle sort of drives it. Bring the mic over, please.
Sorry, I wasn't going to keep going, but I'll just, but the difference now, isn't it, in a digital economy, like your bird's eye in the 1920s, right? So we saw a lot of people compete successfully in that category over 100 years, right, in the frozen food category. Yes. What we're seeing now in a digital economy is you almost do need to, speed is imperative and disruption is imperative. You can't carve out your 15%. You've got to own it.
That's exactly right. That's the whole point. And that's why we believe that creation wins as opposed to making better wins, right? You have to redefine the whole context in which people think. And if you think about what is a category is actually a solution to a problem we all have or feel. The solution to the inability to communicate with people around the world was actually a thing called the social network, right? So what the problem was, hey, I want to be able to share photos with all of my friends from Australia, and I'm in the United States, I used to email them photographs. This thing came along and solved that problem, right? And so you as the category king define the sort of the terms under which the conversation happens around the problem. That's what categories actually are, and they do evolve over time. But I'd be super interested in what you guys think too.
Yeah, I also want to say that there is so much, the technology stack is growing every day, every month, such that there are new categories opening up that couldn't be done before. So you couldn't have had Salesforce without, you know, cloud-based networking, VMware, without, you know, we can't have a lot of these cloud software without AWS. What a category killer that is.
Unbelievable.
And that technology is marching. So what's next? Driverless cars. Huge category there to be there for the winning. And then you've got all the enablers of driverless cars, which is really just a robot with artificial intelligence and machine learning built into it. You've got the sensors, the LiDARs that sit on the driverless cars. That's just one little egg of new categories that's out there. And I think that there's an explosion of technology right now based on the stack.
And that is a real interesting one. I mean, you think about the term driverless cars. Remember Henry Ford? He had a horseless carriage. That's not a category, driverless cars. There's some other category, automobile was the actual category, not driverless cars. There's some other category lurking in here that someone's going to define and do exactly what you just said.
It's called the chauffeur.
Okay, chauffeur is
it's
one
mobility.
solution to that, but it probably isn't going to be the solution, John.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Facebook's a really interesting one, right? Because, you know, now anyone under 25 hates Facebook, and yet it's got, I don't know how many billion people, like more people on Earth, 1.6 billion people. And so what have they done? They invested really heavily in virtual reality. And, you know, 2016 was the year of virtual reality, and now you go into Officeworks and they're on sale for $99 now. So there is this cyclic nature, and I think sort of often being number two can be an interesting position to be in, but you can't just be doing the same thing. You have to be doing something differently. So, you know, now if you're under 25, everyone's on Snapchat, Instagram, all those kinds of, basically, they're owned by, well, Snapchat's owned by Facebook now.
Instagram.
Instagram's owned by Facebook.
That's right.
That would be a big takeover.
Yeah, and you know, there's lots of rumours about Twitter getting taken over, and you know there were rumours that Sony were going to buy them, Apple were going to buy them, and so on. But they're still hanging in there, and they still fulfil a really valuable role. Perhaps they're not the biggest or the best, but they're certainly iconic, and I think that's an interesting position to be in too.
Yeah. Okay, another question. Yes, sir.
Look, I'd like to put it to Rick, but also to all the panellists. Yeah. Has there been a category change in venture capital funding? And if there hasn't been to date, is that something that you visualise needs to occur to anticipate the explosion you'd like to see in Australia of this entrepreneurial skill set?
Yeah. So I think there has been, and I would say that, as I hope we are one of the defining organisations that's growing up in it. So Australian venture has been through a number of waves, and in 2012 there was almost no venture left in the system. It was scorched earth. There were like a couple of smaller funds that had a little, literally a few slots left. And the Australian superannuation funds, who are the natural funders of the ecosystem, had turned off the tap.
Why was that?
Because they hadn't got the returns that they wanted out of the last batch of venture funds that they'd backed. And they decided that it was not an asset class to back. And that was at the point at which we started Blackbird Ventures, because we thought that was a really awesome contrarian opportunity to go and find, at the same time we had this thesis of finding founders to back our fund. And so our first fund is $29 million, a tiny fund. We have 97 limited partners, investors in that fund. It took us 22 months to raise. We had 530 meetings in order to raise that fund. It just was crazy. And we were counting. So since 2012, there have been a new, group of VCs that have popped up, and I think that's really, really exciting. I think these VCs are looking at the problem in a different way. I think they're taking, hopefully, a lot of the learnings from the past group. I think they're much more oriented towards the way Silicon Valley is doing it, and the optimism and taking bigger risks, not so much being financial investors, but trying to be real helpful investors. And we're starting to see the superannuation funds start to come back in the market. And we're still learning, we're still a young industry, but I feel really good about it. It's a really good start. We're 4 years, the new industry is 4 years into a very long journey, but it's feeling good.
Is this a global phenomenon?
Just ask that question again, John. What was the question?
Is this a global phenomena?
So in Silicon Valley, it's been there. This is just it's continued to accelerate in Silicon Valley, and we've seen lots of new what are called micro VC funds, smaller funds pop up in Silicon Valley in an ecosystem that until recently was dominated by about 6 firms. 6 firms had done most of the category kings, right?
Yep.
And what we're seeing now is these micro VCs who jumped in underneath at a time when it was really contrarian to bet on the early stage and there's a gap in the market there, step up and become the next. So we're starting to see a little bit of sort of change and flux in Silicon Valley. But around the world, in non-Silicon Valley, I think, yes, absolutely it's happening. It's becoming far more, the barriers to success and building big companies out of Silicon Valley are coming down and continue to come down.
I was going to actually add that point, which I think what's the great thing that's happened in Australia is the global focus. So this idea that Blackbird has this thesis they'll only invest in companies that are global from day one. That's a big change. It's not people saying, we know the local industry, we have local relationships, come in and we can help you succeed. It's, we only want you if you're going to a market we don't understand. And that's actually really cool. And I think we're seeing it here in Australia. You're definitely seeing it in Europe. So you're seeing like Point 9 Capital and Atomico and some of these ones that are founded by investors and entrepreneurs. And they're doing the same thing. And it's actually taking advantage of the fact that the Valley is really myopic. And so there's this incredible concentration, but there's so much that they never look beyond the city mile. And there's all these opportunities for people outside that are willing to try a bit harder and go a little bit further. Yeah. So it's actually quite exciting.
Yeah, that's great.
I'm not sure if this is where you were going, but I think one thing that's interesting to think about is equity crowdfunding, and I'm thinking of things like AngelList and sort of the unbundling of VC. I don't think that anyone's really turning down term sheets from Sequoia and Benchmark to take a syndicate lead on AngelList, but I think they're definitely like filling a gap that previously wasn't being filled in that way. So I think that's an interesting one. And then I guess the question will be: is there a global winner, i.e., AngelList, and there's no AngelList for Australia or AngelList for Singapore or whatever, or does the territory get carved up regionally?
Okay, we have a question down here, Michael, please.
Victor Purton. My experience in the United States and Latin America as well is there's this incredible positive stereotype of Australia. And we've seen success in all sorts of fields, from decision support software to Like, but the real positive stereotypes are in sport, you know, John's field, in booze, in Tasmanian food, in water technology. So, you know, when you in Silicon Valley and people in Boston and elsewhere are thinking Australia, is there an advantage to coming in one of those categories where people say, hey, that makes sense, these are Australians, they know the field?
Yeah, well, we were talking about it before. I'd be interested in these thoughts as well, but we were talking about it before that you kind of need one to start the ball rolling. And the first one that started the ball rolling in this country was for sure Atlassian. Now, there were a number of incredible regional kings, from car sales to REA to these companies that adapted things for this part of the world. Great businesses, wonderful. But the one that really tipped was, I think, Atlassian. And if you think about Silicon Valley itself, it tipped when, you know, Hewlett-Packard and before that, the founders that came out of that kind of emerged as a new generation of entrepreneurs and VCs. That's when it goes. And that's what's happening now. And I mean, you tell me what percentage of your funds are owned by those folks from Atlassian or Atlassian Association. It must be probably, well, you tell me, what percentage is?
Of our funds.
Of your funds come from the founders of those companies or anyone associated with it?
So the first fund is all from Aussie founders.
Yep.
The second fund, 2 super funds came in, so it's 20% from them and 80% from the super funds. But by numbers, it's
probably still pretty high.
It's high.
So the ball starts rolling, and I think, you know, as an Australian looking at Australia, I think the questions I asked, and I'd love to hear from Didier here, the immediate sort of response is, I get how you can build a product in Australia. Like the engineering is just great, Monash University, wonderful computer science education, and there's others, you know, in this part of the world. I guess there's 10 out of the top 100 engineering schools are from Australia, which is pretty amazing. So the engineering side of this thing, I get why the product would be good, but tell me now how you're going to sort of enter and penetrate, you know, the US marketplace or the European marketplace or whatever it might be. Where's that chops coming from? And Didier, I'd be fascinated to sort of hear how you approach that.
Sure, and I think just to also sort of directly answer the question, my personal view as an entrepreneur, which is always contrarian, is there's no point going where we're known for. I don't go on trade missions. I don't join other groups. I don't go to these other places. You know, I get lucky, blessed, whatever. In my previous life, I worked for Hollywood. We're in a company in Adelaide doing work for Hollywood. So I kind of had into my head that it was possible to do this from anywhere. And so when I started this thing, and so why is it that Adobe asks us to help them with their people and culture? I don't know. Nobody else gave them what they needed. You know, we were foolish and naive enough to think this problem needed to be solved, and we banged on the door until they let us in, and then we showed them something that they thought was better than everything else. And so for me, that's the most important thing. That said, we draw a lot of inspiration from those fields. I'm from Adelaide, so winemaking is a huge thing. You know, you look at that, that's where the creativity and the ingenuity comes from, and that's what we get inspired by. But a lot of it is turning up, getting over there, realizing that, and I learned this in Hollywood as well, when we're competing against LA companies. For a lot of people we were competing with, it was just a job. For us, it was everything. It's still true. You go to the Valley, 2/3 of the people working in those companies don't feel like they're working in a startup. They're earning a good wage at a big business. They're not startups. I mean, they're multi-billion-dollar companies. And so for us, that's what we had to harness and build, and people respond to it. They just want people to care about their problem, which is why I think the category king thing works, because if you do it well, you're articulating to somebody that you understand their problem like nobody else, and that opens so many doors.
Yeah, and the funny thing about that is that if you go to a doctor and you've got a sore knee and the doctor says, I know that exact problem, it's this, 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 and this, you immediately think, well, that guy knows the answer too, right? So that's the whole point you're making, which is category kings do that. They frame the problem in a way that makes you think, oh, gee, of course, he's going to know the answer better than anyone else. Rick?
No, I just want to say something to the category of Australian success. I actually really don't like that way of thinking. I don't want people to say, you know, we should do mining tech in Australia and ag tech and sport tech because we're good at them. Because that just pushes founders into thinking they can only do that stuff. There's this kind of mentality in Australia of, oh, we couldn't do that in Australia. We couldn't build a space business in Australia because that's what they do in the US. So we just backed 2 space companies in Australia, and I think we're going to kickstart the space industry in Australia, and we're going to make boatloads of money doing it. And there's no reason why that can't happen in Australia. There's no reason why the solution to the LiDAR, which is going to unlock the new automobiles, not using the word driverless cars,
can't come from a Sydney-based company. I get people in Silicon Valley saying, "Oh, whoa, it could happen in Australia." Of course it could. We don't need to be defined by these historical things that we were good at.
My question is there an advantage to being in one of those fields?
I-
You drive Route 66, the favourite beer is Foster's. So a start-up in beer coming out of Australia or beer technology is more likely to succeed than someone coming from Argentina or Chile.
The largest alcohol company in the world is from South America.
So they are
Yes, exactly.
I understand what you're saying. I just don't like that articulation of how we should build our startup and innovation industry. I think that's the wrong way for us to think about it because it stifles innovation. Okay, another question over here. Thank you. Daryl, thank you.
Thanks so much for your insights. It's really helpful. How do you convince people when you're in a sector where this is perceived, you can't be a category king? How do you convince people that A, you are already in Australia, and B, you're going to do that globally when it's perceived as it's just impossible?
Do you mean that it's impossible to do it from Australia or that it's impossible to solve the problem?
It's impossible to solve the problem.
Well, first of all, I think Didier's done it. You demonstrate that you can. And you first of all, I think he's exactly right. I mean, he's the kind of entrepreneur that we get inspired by. If you articulate the problem, he knocked on the door to Adobe and said, "This is the problem you have," and the HR person felt that problem, like I said, they're then immediately sort of interested in hearing the solution. And now, having said that, if he didn't have a solution, there's no business. So the point is that the product piece of that triangle has to solve the problem, right? You don't have a business unless you've got that. And then once you've got that, then you have to create the company piece. How do you sell it? How do you distribute it? What's the price? And how do you package it and all that stuff? And then the final piece is the category. So did I answer your question or not?
Yeah, I think so. I would say that we're in healthcare, so software for doctors and software for patients. So say in Australia, if you want to find a practitioner, 50% chance you're going to use us. We've got 25% of the market share in Australia, and we've done it off seed funding. And we have practitioners and customers in about 50 different countries. So we're wanting to do what we've done in Australia, more in Australia, but globally. But people perceive healthcare, it's this old, staid industry. Every country has its own health system. And that's actually what we've solved. We've solved the ability to customise to each health system quickly. And so whenever you talked about, Didier, you talked about raising capital. When we raised our seed round, we spoke to 134 people. It was just, nobody would get what we were talking about. And it was good once it worked, but it's still difficult to convince people that you can do it in an industry like healthcare. And I would say the same for other sort of more conservative government-involved industries as well.
Yeah.
And it's difficult to do that anywhere in the world. It's really hard to get that up. And I think it's your extra challenge to articulate it in a really convincing way. But obviously the great thing about that is if you're in a contrarian space where everyone thinks it's too hard, that gives you the wide open space to create the category.
Yes. Yeah, and I was going to say,
it's a two-edged sword.
It is, and I was going to say that actually health tech and healthcare is actually a big investment theme that's happening in Silicon Valley right now. We're working with a couple of companies that are just blowing the doors off this thing. And everyone knows it's a problem in America. Put aside Trump and all of the other crazy crap that's going on. Everyone knows that healthcare is a really big problem, like $1 trillion problem, and the person or the company or the individual that solves that thing is really going to become a very wealthy person and solve some real things. And so there is big investments happening in that now.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing you're hinting on, which is absolutely true, is that if you go to the US with that story, you will get zero value for all of your customers, all of your revenue, all of your technology. If there's someone over there who studied under a professor at Stanford who wrote a paper on this, they are more knowledgeable than you are. That's just the way it works. So the only way to get their interest is to get over there and win somehow. Get in there and show them what you can do. It's not fair, it's not reasonable, but it is reality that they don't see what we do here as being in any way transferable to what's going on over there.
That's also true for Maryland and Austin and Fort Lauderdale.
Oakland.
And Oakland, exactly. I mean, that's just the way it is. Yeah. Okay, next question. Yes, sir.
Well, it's Srijan here from Monash University. The other day I was reminded about Yahoo and every now and then I get emails from people that have Hotmail accounts. And your trends and your plots also showed some companies, a bunch of different companies, and then they eventually get overtaken by one, to go back to your earlier point. So I'm really interested in failures and people and businesses and startups who have failed. And maybe Samantha, how many businesses or startups do you see that come through the door every year, and how many do they actually make it through? And what can we learn from some of those failures? And should they have an exit strategy? I mean, we've got a lot of supporters for winners, people who want to invest in early startups, but who's actually helping those that need to exit at some point and maybe invest in some other markets or new areas, startup within startup if they fail, the whole fast model?
I'll let Rick take the exit bit, but I'll take the first bit around failure. So we have a 50% funding rate, which ensures life for a period beyond that. And chances are, if they can raise their first round, they'll continue to keep raising rounds, and that's data from sort of six years old. Of the companies that fail, a bit over 50% fail because of founder breakup. So it's actually not necessarily an external thing, it's an internal thing. And the fact is that starting a startup is bloody hard and stressful, and a lot of the time those relationships haven't been stress tested to that degree that you might find under an accelerator program, and it just breaks up under pressure. Different vision, incompatible working styles, etc., etc. But I guess the little known thing that, from failure is that they don't really fail. Like, they all go on to have much more successful careers than from where they came from. I mean, I just did kind of a bit of a hit list the other day because some other StartMate companies were wanting to hire product managers and other senior leaders, and so they're at Series B kind of now. And just going through the list that heads of engineering at Dropbox, heads of this and that, they all take a massive step up career-wise when they fail in their startup through StartMate, because the skills that you learn trying to build a company, build something out of nothing, is incredibly valuable. And I think as a community, we should all be far less scared of failure because it's a wonderful learning experience.
Well, just before Rick answers the exit question, let me just give you some context. So you were saying, the companies that fail. Well, let me give you some numbers. Tech companies founded since 2000 in the United States, 35,000. Tech companies that received a Series A, 10,000. Number of companies that went public, 220. That's the reality of startup world. That's the reality of high tech. That's the reality of the risk profile of these companies. It's not a straight line. And the funnel is incredibly thin. Those companies that make it through that gauntlet, are pretty well battle tested. They're going to be successful. So in America, they wouldn't call that failure. Honestly, that's what happens. Most of those companies don't, quote, get an exit. They're on to the next thing. And there's an ecosystem that exactly what you were saying is picking those people up and putting them in a new job. And there's recruiters who follow all the companies that, quote, fail so they can place those people in the new ones. So they don't think like that. They really don't. They think about this is the normal process. It's an incredibly tight funnel. And that's just the way it is. Rick?
I'm not sure quite where you want me to go with exits. I would say, if we're talking about exits at the time of failure, there is a time where you have to have the heart-to-heart conversation with a founder. Is this the best thing you're doing with your time? Money, whatever else, there's more of, but there's not more of time in your life, and is it better to go on and do something else? So that's a tough conversation to have, but we definitely have to have that with people. But I'd just really emphasize, Sam, said it well, is that it's almost the best thing you can do is start a business and have, some success and fail in terms of your career right now. Like, it is the best thing on your CV to have been a founder. You meet the best people and you get hired into these roles that are way above anything you could have done before you started. It's a really low risk thing to do now.
Yeah.
And people don't quite understand that for their careers.
Okay, next question. Any other questions from the audience? Yes, Nikki. Keep thinking.
I'll be really quick.
That's okay, we've still got plenty of time.
Mine's actually around founder mentality, because I deal with people in the US, the UK, but also here in Australia. And one of the things that a lot of Australians start out with is this tall poppy syndrome and the fact that the government doesn't support an entrepreneurial spirit, whereas, you know, in the US, people will just start 7 companies in 90 days because they'll try something X. It's like, so what I love about a lot of the incubator projects, but also the larger M&As, once a company's gone through something else, is working on the founder foundation, so that whole healthy, wealthy, wise aspect and what to do to pick yourself up. With you guys on your panel, when you're looking for founder mentality that people can sustain the pace, the entrepreneurial spirit, however long they've been trading, what do you think is important for us to help share more within the Australian market now to really lift up and level up that play bigger thinking and support the founders that just keep feeling they're against brick walls all the time? So obviously you do that all within your companies, but as a panel, if you had to say the top 2 things that we can best support our Australian founders on, what would that be for a mentality?
Let's have Didier answer that question because he's one of them. So what did you do, Didier?
Well, I mean, the first piece of advice I always give somebody when they say, you know, what advice would you give to somebody who wants to start a company? My first piece of advice is don't. It's hard. It's really, really hard. And it's only if you're like too stubborn to take that advice that I would then say, okay, you know, do X, Y, Z. And I think back to the failure point, you kind of have to accept that you're going to fail. Now, if you're okay with the idea that you're going to fail anyway, but you still have to do it because it's so important, so meaningful to you that you're okay with that, that's probably a good place to start. Honestly, I think the most important thing that we can do as a group, as a country, is actually not about entrepreneurs at all. And it's about just how we think about families and people around us. So, you know, one of the things that we talk about at work is that no matter how important the business is to you, you borrow the time that you're at work from people that are much more important than your business is. And so what are you doing with that time? And how do we have better conversations with those people? You know, I have 2 children. How do I be more present when I'm home if I'm going to get up at 3 a.m. to do a call? You know, how do I try and make that bit count? And I think that's not just for founders, that's for all of us trying to cope with this whole work-life thing. That's really sort of, in the startup world, that's taken to the nines. So concepts of resilience, mental well-being, a lot of the stuff that's starting to come out now where we're actually trying to work on how we can make all of this work when we're all flawed. That's, I think, the most powerful thing, is just to lean into that and learn from it.
John, I'd be interested to sort of hear your perspective on this. You're teaching these folks. Do you talk about this stuff?
Yeah, a little bit. I think there's a generational change. I think you've kind of hit a point that Australia in the past has often had this sort of tall poppy thing, and the whole idea of failure as being something that should be just locked away and not talked about. And I mean, you know, universities help reinforce that because we have fail grades, and you say you failed the subject. You know, that's really bad. And I think it's just that word kind of permeates you, and you think, yeah, I can't afford to fail, and that causes a lot of problems, particularly, you know, this whole idea of burnout where people have to work massive hours just to, you know, to just get something done. But I think that is changing now. I think people are becoming, the whole nature of work is changing anyway, right? The way that people work now is changing. The way that people have to keep reskilling is changing as well. And I think that the side effect of that is, in fact, that you do have to accept failure because everyone's going to fail in their careers from now on. Nobody's going to have a job for life anymore. Right. So you're going to have to reskill. You're going to have to keep working and keep thinking about, well, how can I improve on what I did before?
Well, on that note, I want you to put your hands together and say thank you much. Unbelievable time. So also I'd like you to thank again John Bertrand. It's wonderful having you. We're really only touching on some of the topics that we do touch on with Play Bigger. So if you're interested in this area or interested in this field, please feel free to, you know, go to Booktopia or Amazon, wherever you want, buy a copy of the book, take a read, send us comments. We'd love to get feedback from anyone who's reading this thing. And on behalf of Monash University, Belinda, who are the publishers of the book, and Hachette, which is the publisher of the printed book, we'd like to thank you for attending tonight. And please have a round of drinks on us.